Welcome to South Central Regional Library's Safe Inside Your Walls programming, supported by Safe at Home Manitoba.
Hi, here's another video brought to you by Safe at Home Manitoba. My name is Joyce, and today we're going to learn how to piece letters. And it's from this book. And here's a sample. They can be really big, they can be smaller, or they can be tiny. This is another project I did. It's a poem I learned when I was in elementary school. I put it around the edge of a landscape quilt. In the end, I didn't like the landscape quilt, so I took it off, and I'm still now trying to decide what I will do with it. Here's a couple more projects. This is a wall hanging. You can see the letters are a little bit bigger than the poem. I actually haven't finished this one yet. It's my next project. These are two pillows with messages on them. This is another wall hanging I did down on Maggie's farm. These letters are quite small, and I pieced all the animals using the same basic technique as we use for the letters. I had no pattern, and they're all free-pieced. This is my favorite that I ever made. It's a wall hanging. Ain't nobody here but us chickens. And all the chickens are pieced without a pattern. Took me a whole day to put the legs on the rooster. And then somebody said, well, I think you need a fox to get in the chicken house. So there's the fox. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what fabrics you could use. The main thing is a good contrast. So you can see if I had black background with this very light words, it would show up really well. Also with the brown, it would be fine. Or I might have this background, put the black words on. Here, maybe you're doing a Halloween quilt. That would be nice. Or you could do the orange and the brown. Because the orange is so bright, you'd probably get contrast. Here we have a patterned fabric, which would be all right. If you're using patterns though, be very careful. For example, if you're making little letters and you use a big pattern like this, some of the letters will be green, some red, some white, which might be what you want. I generally avoid stripes, because they can be confusing in the background. You have to watch that they're going the same direction. I love this contrast. You could do it either way, white letters or dark letters. And all the letters don't need to be the same. So I went into my handy dandy scrap box and I found some different possibilities. This one might be all right if you're doing bigger letters. If you're doing little tiny ones, probably wouldn't be so good. That would look nice here, but you can see if you put the letters here, you wouldn't see the words at all. Orange is always good, lots of contrast. This is a scrap from my poem. This one, if you're doing small letters, some of them might come out quite white. And if you were doing it on here, you could see how part of the letter could easily disappear. Gray would be a nice neutral background, or you can have a very subtle print. This one might work, but your letters would all be a different color. If you wanted that, that would be fine. Sometimes you want to make every letter different. So if I were doing that, I'd go to my scrap box. Wow, look at that. So I'd dig around a bit and I would find, oh, there's a nice piece. Now I'd dig a little deeper and try to find a contrast. Those two might be nice together. Here's a piece of dark. What would I go with it? I wouldn't do that. This one might have too much of a contrast, so I'd throw it back. Find something else. Oh, here's a nice one. I could put bright red letters on that one. Anyway, you do collect scraps after a while. I have little friends who like to roll around in it. I haven't tried that yet. I bet it's fun. So this book has very detailed instructions how to do each letter, and it's also got a chart at the back with numbers of what step you're supposed to do first. So I've decided to use a dark background and light colored letters. The first thing we do is cut a few strips. The backgrounds, sometimes you need wider strips, but I'll cut a couple of them. This one is 1.5 inches about. And we'll need some smaller ones too. And these don't have to be straight at all. You can cut them. You can cut one like this because sometimes you need narrow and sometimes you need wide. You'll need more background. I can't really give you amounts because it depends totally on the size of your letters. That Breathe letters were big and it took quite a bit of fabric. But this one is going to be a little bit small. So what we start first with the A is these two little center pieces. And the size of them dictates the size of your letter, your finished letter. So I'm going to make them fairly small. So I'll put a little piece of this. Also remember your 1/4 inch seams. So it's going to be quite a lot smaller once you sew them together. All right, so I should have done it the other way because I'm doing opposite, but anyway. Yeah, I'll do the dark letters and the light fabric because it'll be a little bit easier to follow. So what I need first is a light piece and a dark piece of both the same size. So I'll make maybe about this big, and the light one about the same. And I'm going to sew those together, right sides together, always. I've pressed this towards the dark. You always need to press things. I'm just going to trim it nice and straight. And I think I want the dark and the light to be about equal. So I'll trim a little bit of the white off. So now, step 3 is putting a dark piece on the end here. Notice the dark is at the top, the light at the bottom, and then a wider dark piece here. So and I usually cut them bigger than I think I will need. It's easier to trim it than to rip it off and do it again. You'll notice that we're working from the center towards outside. 1 and 2 are these center pieces. Now I've just sewed on number 3. I've done 1, 2, and 3. Now I'm going to do number 4. That's a piece on the bottom, right here. And it's going to be a little wider. Now I'm going to put number 4 here, but I see that I didn't trim this. It's not quite even, so I'll do that first. And we're not concerned about square angles or anything like that. Okay, it was like this, so now like this. And I'm going to cut it a little bit wider and trim it later. So right sides together. sew it and then press it. I'm pressing it towards the dark. Generally, I press it towards the one piece that has the least seams. This piece has seams, this one doesn't. Now I'm going to trim this one because I have some little edges sticking out. You could do this without a rotary cutter, but it would be a lot harder. All right, let's look at what we have here. We have this piece. And number 5 is background on the top. So the background will be here. I'm using quite a thin piece for here. Could be a little bit wider, but I'll use a thin one. I'm going to sew it on the top here and then trim it. Some of my seams are even smaller than 1/4 inch. This time I pressed towards the white because there were no seams on the white, or the light, I guess it's not white. Now, number 5 is this piece. So that one is dark, and that's what I'll do next. For this one, I'm going to make that back piece a little bit wider. I can always trim it narrower at the end. And again, I'm making it a little bit bigger than I need. This time I have all these seams here, so I'm going to press it towards the dark piece that has no seams. Now I trim. And we only have one more piece across the top. Sometimes I like to make the bottom pieces wider, and the top piece is narrower, but it doesn't matter. So the top piece will be dark. And again, I'm going to cut it a bit wider and sew it together. And again, I pressed it, and I'll trim it. And we have an A. And the tricky part is, we also have an E. So if you want to join words together, you have to put background pieces on each side and on the top and bottom. I usually do the sides, and then I'll do the top and bottom later when I have all my letters made, because some have to be wider and some narrower. But I'll do the side ones. Also between words I would put a wider piece. But right now let's put a side piece on the E. Or should I do an A? Okay, I already cut a side piece for the front and for the back. Now I'm going to sew these on and then press them. Right sides together, don't forget that. I'm going to press light this time because the light has no seams, and now I'll trim. Now we're going to do the letter M. It's probably the most difficult one of all. The good thing though is when you finish the M, you've also got a W. I'm using altogether different colors for the M. I've got some bright blue for the letters, and I've got this print for the background. The print is quite delicate, so it shouldn't interfere with the letters too much. I'm going to start with the middle of the M. I want it to be about the same size as E, but I'll make it longer so I can trim it. And I'll put the E aside so I don't cut it by accident. And I have to cut this angle, and I have to be very careful not to cut this one. Ask me how I know. This way. Not too close to the top. And then we're going to set a piece of blue in here. So I want that piece to be quite narrow, but I have to allow for seams. So maybe I'll make it about like this. And it doesn't have to be straight either. These letters are very forgiving. So that's going to go in there. Again, I check that it looks all right, and I'm going to make sure right sides are together. That's why it's easier to sew with something that you can really tell the right from the wrong side. I've made lots of mistakes using fabric that looks very similar on both sides. I'm going to press the seams out on this one because if I press them in, they might overlap, especially if I had a narrower blue. But I will check on the front, make sure there's no little pleats. It's a little bit wider than I normally would like, but we'll see how it goes. Now we're going to trim it on both sides. Trim there, all there. See how it's kind of crooked? I'll just straighten it out. That's why I used a wider piece than I'm going to end up with. There's the first part of the M. Now I need another one exactly the same. So again, make sure I've got the right angle here. And this time, I'm going to use a narrower piece. I can see which one looks better. Now I'm going to sew this and then press it. All right, I'm going to trim it. This one seems a little bit close to the top. Might have been better if I'd have put the cut down a little bit further, but we'll see. Now, I probably like the thinner one better, but there's no rule that says they have to be the same. Now we need a piece in between. I think that's going to be too skinny. It would be all right if I didn't have to have a seam, but once I have the seam, there won't be much left. So I'll get a little bit thicker of a piece. So about this long. And make it this thick. And then we'll have one here and one here. It should look like an M. I'm going to sew these together and then press them. This time I'm going to press it towards the middle. If I had a narrower blue piece I wouldn't be able to do that, but this time I can. That way I'm not pressing the seams out. Doesn't look like an M yet, does it? Now I need the two end pieces, so here's one. And this one I'll cut, but it'll have to be quite a bit narrower. And I'm going to sew these on. It still doesn't look much like an M, but I think if I sew it a bit closer, it'll look more like an M, and I'll trim it after. I'll press these towards the blue because there's no seams on the blue. Still not quite an M, but we'll trim it and see what happens. All right, I'm going to trim this and hope it looks a little bit more like an M then. I'll trim the bottom off. And it might look better if this is a little bit narrower. Now I'm going to put the borders along the side, and you can see if I would have the top and bottom, it would look more like an M. Okay, I'm going to sew these on. And I'm going to trim this again. This M might look nicer if the space between here is a little bit narrower. But I'll show you a couple of other M's to see how they can be very different and still look like an M. So you can see that this M is quite a bit skinnier, but it's still the same. And it looks more like an M when it's with the other letters. And the N is very similar. And the U is the same as the N. So here's the M. Sorry, here's the M. Here it is as a W. You can see that the M on farm is quite different. I made these pieces very wide and these pieces very narrow. It still looks like an M. And here I've got a W done the same way. And I kept the upright pieces wide and the angle pieces very narrow. Thanks for joining us for another Safe at Home video. You can get this book. It's available at South Central Library. It's got much more detailed instructions. And maybe you too can make a word quilt. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this Safe at Home Manitoba production. Stay safe inside your walls.